They had reconnected by chance here, but he didn't believe in his entire life had been built on strategy, meticulously planning every detail down to the last detail. However, he wasn't ready to walk away from this. It wasn't just a chance encounter. It was something much bigger. Adrian barely noticed his as he made his way through the city streets in the taxi. Even though she tried to keep her gaze fixed on the road, he noticed the way she looked in the mirror. She was experiencing this as well. Her fingers slightly trembled against the wheel. Weight of the past, the unexpected pull of the present. Elena, he said quietly, putting her name on his tongue. As if saying it would somehow make it real after all these years, she sharply inhaled. Yes, he wanted to ask so many questions, her grip slightly tightening, wanted to touch her in order to show him that she wasn't just a figment of his imagination. He settled on the only important thing. I missed you. Her breath caught in her eyes, flitting in the mirror toward him, and for a brief moment he saw the same yearning he had felt for years, the same ache he had hidden for years surfacing with such ferocity that neither of them anticipated. Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't empty. Rather, it was full of everything they weren't saying before Elena finally whispered, I... Adrian's heart clenched at the confession, and the night suddenly stopped. I missed you too. No longer feel so frigid, the city stretched out before them, and the lights were shining, bright. But Adrian knew one thing as he sat in that taxi and stared at the woman he had never forgotten. He knew this was only the beginning, and he couldn't let fate pass him by. A second time away from him, Adrian couldn't stop staring at Elena as the car moved. He was overcome with emotions as he walked the city streets. He had spent years imagining the experience of seeing her once more, but never in this way. It was strange to be in a taxi where she was the driver and he was just a passenger. The years had changed her, but not in a way that dimmed him, as if fate had played the cruelest yet most beautiful trick on him. Her quiet strength, her maturity and appearance, and her beauty, if anything, her expression was even more stunning than the Elena he had previously known. In her eyes were bright because college had been full of dreams, always reaching for the stars. Now with ambition, as he looked at her, he saw something new, quiet resilience as opposed to strength that spoke of battles that were fought in the shadows, and yet deep within those he still saw the girl with his hazel eyes, the one who had accidentally won his heart, all those Elena. He finally broke the silence years ago, this time speaking softly, as if it would make this moment more real if you said her name. You needed to hear her say something that would reassure him because he needed confirmation. Him. This wasn't a dream. Her eyes flickered to the couple in the rearview mirror. He caught her attention for a fleeting moment before she turned and grabbed the wheel a little bit tighter. Adrian, she said, her voice carrying the... He memorized her face as he studied the weight of the years that had passed between them. Every little thing, from the faint shadows that were under her eyes to the way she pressed her lips together as if she were avoiding speaking. Wasn't Elena the one he knew always talking about big dreams? This Elena, who had been so radiant, might have been stronger, but likewise burdened as if she had been carrying the entire world on her shoulders for a great deal too long. He asked you gently, his words having more meaning than he could possibly convey. Expressed that he was not merely pondering the taxi, but also the reason she was present instead of pursuing the fantasies she had once told him about. He was asking about everything. The things that had changed her over the years. The pain she appeared to be experiencing. Life happened. She replied simply, to be hiding behind that tiny bittersweet smile. And despite the fact that the response was hazy, it contained an unspoken story about him. He had a burning desire to hear from Adrian, who had always been open up to him prior to her bright laughter and passionate words. Now there was a guardedness and hesitation in her voice that made him wonder how much she had endured during their time apart. Wanted to know everything about her disappearance and her presence here after college. Now I understand why she appeared to be someone who had learned to live rather than dream. He remained silent, unwilling to push, because he could tell she wasn't ready to talk. Despite this, the taxis could not look away as they slowed down at a red light in the city, shining all around them. But Adrian could only make out her in the silence. There were a lot of unspoken words and no memories between them. Them had the bravery to inquire, "Do you still remember college?" Tinged with nostalgia in the hope of reconnecting with a piece of the past, Elena's eyes softened. "Of course I do," she murmured as a warm flicker crossed her face. He was overcome by a flood of memories during the late-night study. Sessions in which he would act like he was more interested in books than her hair falling over her shoulder or the coffee. Shop meetings where, despite her protests, he would always demand payment for her drink. The peaceful moments when he would steal a glance at her, he would remember the way she smiled, the never once gaining the courage to express his feelings to her, the because of the way she had unintentionally become his main distraction and biggest regret. She then said something that broke him. "Back then, I had a crush on someone." She admitted it in a barely audible whisper, as if she weren't sure whether or not to. Out loud, Adrian's heartbeat quickened. If she had felt the same, could it have been him? Way he had always wanted to know, but he couldn't say it out loud. The moment quickly passed as she watched the light turn green. When he released the gas pedal, he clenched his jaw in frustration. It was truly cruel of fate to bring them together after so many years, only for make fun of him by asking, "Where do you want me to drop you?" "And what ifs?" she asked abruptly, changing the subject with such ease that it made his heart sink. She was attempting to establish distance. To prevent whatever this was from expanding, Adrian was not prepared. To not let her go again, he hesitated briefly, his mind racing, and he knew it. She gave him his address and let the ride end just like any other, acting like it was just a coincidence. But he could not because he was convinced, deep down, that this was more than fate playing games. Was a chance, and he didn't want to miss it. "How about dinner?" suggested that, as he said the words, his heart was pounding, and Elena's hands were still on the wheel, her eyes slightly wider in the mirror for dinner. She repeated, as if the concept itself were foreign to her. "Yes," he said this time with more force. "Let's catch." Up he could see in her eyes the hesitation, the struggle between wanting to say yes, and he wanted to flee. And he briefly feared that she would choose the later, but she did so after what seemed like an eternity. Adrian felt something inside him as he nodded okay. He lifted a weight from his chest that he hadn't realized he was carrying, smiled, unable to conceal the relief and excitement he felt about this was his chance to realize what could have been after years of regret. Finally had the chance to get to know her again and learn why fate had brought her, bringing them back together, to see if there was still something in between them to keep hold of. The city star extended before them, and the lights shining bright against the night sky. But Adrian didn't care about it at the time. Anything else because, for the first time in 8 years, he had faith that this would happen. Wasn't just a passing hope that he wouldn't lose her again? That their story was just getting started this time, Adrian couldn't contain herself. He was overcome with emotion and had envisioned numerous scenarios of meeting Elena once more, but nothing had come close to what was actually happening before. He saw right in front of him the woman who had been nothing more than a bittersweet memory for the previous 8 years. Him, and he didn't want to miss this opportunity when Elena pulled up outside. She turned to face him in a cozy, dimly lit restaurant in the city center, uncertain. Adrian asked with her fingers gripping the steering wheel, "Eyes, are you sure about this?" Wheel as if it were her anchor, he fixedly fixed his gaze on her. I've never been more certain of his beating heart in his chest. He was firm in everything he said, and when he saw her again, it felt like a second chance, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that fate presented to him, but which he lacked. She slightly parted her lips as if she wanted to walk away from it, say something, but she immediately shook her head and got out of the taxi. Adrian followed her, his heart beating faster with each step. His expression was guarded. As I walked toward the restaurant's entrance, I saw a charming little spot filled with golden lights, intimate and inviting atmosphere, and the aroma of freshly baked goods. The aroma of bread and aromatic herbs filled the air, bringing back memories of the small cafe where he used to sit across from Elena and sneak a glance at her back when she wasn't looking, but she was quietly falling more and more in love. His nostalgia came over him like a wave, and he took a moment to enjoy the sheer beauty of having her back in front of him. They were seated at a small table by the window, where the city lights gave Elena's face a soft glow. She looked stunning, even in her hazel eyes were reflected in the flickering candlelight of her simple attire, making them sparkle with a feeling Adrian couldn't quite understand. He wasn't sure if it was reluctance or something more fundamental, but he did know that he wanted to break through the barriers she had erected around herself. He desired a second chance at knowing her in order to comprehend everything that had occurred during their time apart, and he observed as she intermittently stirred. Before she finally spoke, she said, lifting her drink because she was lost in thought. Eyes to meet his, Adrian Carter, who once detested dressing in suits, become a CEO, although there was a layer of curiosity beneath her light, teasing voice. Life has a funny way of leading us to, he chuckled while leaning back in his chair. Places where we had no idea existed. If someone had informed him when he was in college that he would eventually become Carter's CEO, he would have laughed it off because he had never been the type of person to fantasize about corporate and boardroom meetings, but life had pushed him in a way he hadn't expected, and he didn't regret it. His company was his pride and his legacy. However, right now, seated across, he learned from Elena that even success had been meaningless without someone to share it with her, as her eyes flickered with something that was hard to read. Her tone seemed distant, as if she were speaking from experience, and she finished before he could stop. Himself, the question, "What about you, Elena, the girl who, how did she end up driving a car when she once dreamed of being a top journalist?" Cab, as soon as the words were spoken, he noticed how her expression changed. A shadow crossed her face as her shoulders tensed slightly, and she looked for a moment at away. "That's a long story," she said, playing with the edge of her hair with her fingers. Napkin Adrian leaned forward, speaking softly but firmly. "I've got everything." Even though he had been there for years, night, he wasn't going to let her ignore it. Wondering where she was, what had transpired, and why she had vanished so abruptly after college, and now that he wouldn't let her suffer in silence because she was present. Elena took a deep breath before, after graduating, I finally caught his eye and got an amazing internship. Although my news agency offer was everything I had worked for, life sometimes go according to plan. She paused as if searching for the appropriate words, and Adrian felt he already knew this wasn't going to be a happy situation, as a tight knot formed in his chest. "Recount the events," he inquired, his voice barely audible. She hesitated. "Before I could respond, my father had a medical emergency, so I had to take care of him. Bills started piling up, and I was forced to quit my dream job, so I took whatever work as hard as I could to help him, which led me here." She didn't seem angry. Adrian could hear the hurt beneath her words of hushed acceptance. Adrian's heart aches at her words because of the weight of the sacrifices she had made. He had wondered about her for years, but she had been struggling on her own all along, and he couldn't imagine how much she had endured and lost while he was distracted by his own Elena. He murmured, reaching across the table and placing his gently. The gentle, reassuring, and simultaneously electric touch between their hands on hers was, as he felt her warmth in his palm. Warmth filled him. "You should have told me. I would have been of assistance." His voice was full of genuine regret and a longing to have been there when she needed her most. She gave him a small, sad smile, and shaken Adrian and I stopped talking about her head. And I also never wanted to be a burden for anyone. He silently reassured her that she had never been and would never be a burden to him by slightly tightening his grip on her hand. "Were never an inconvenience to me," and his words were so sincere that Elena's eyes flashed with something fragile for a brief moment. Vulnerable, a light blush began to appear on her cheeks for the first time that evening. Adrian observed as she bit her lower lip as a glimmer of warmth appeared in her eyes. A gesture from their college days that he all too well remembered. The sight of it sent a rush of he felt emotions through him that he had thought he had buried for far too long. He had moved on, realizing that his feelings for Elena had only been fleeting. Infatuation. But now that he was sitting here gazing at her, he realized the truth. He had never stopped thinking about what could have been and how fate had brought them back together. Adrian knew right away that he would not repeat the same error, was not going to let her go once more. This time he would fight for her and refuse to let fate tear her apart. He had lost her once, but he wouldn't lose her again because they were apart. Elena sensed that this time he was willing to do whatever it took to keep her by his side. Adrian's warm hand on hers made his touch both familiar and foreign, contradiction that sent her heart into a tidal wave. It had been a long time since a person had previously held her hand with such tenderness and hushed assurance that she wasn't alone in the world, but Adrian Carter was here. She had secretly loved the man she had convinced herself she would never see again while she was in college. She knew she should step back because she was staring at her as if she were the only thing that mattered. And she also knew that this was risky territory, but she refused to break the connection, possibly out of loneliness. It was the longing she had held in her heart for years, or maybe just perhaps Adrian's expression at her made it appear as though he had been anticipating this moment just as much as she had. She felt a tingle in her spine as his thumb brushed against the back of her hand. "You've been through so much, Elena," he murmured, making her breath hitch. Voice tinged with a feeling she couldn't quite identify you as someone who didn't deserve any, that there was something raw and deeply affected about his voice, which was as if he wished he could have been there to shoulder her burden all those years she had spent struggling. He seemed to be in mourning. Burdens to alleviate her suffering. She forced a small smile by hard swallowing despite the tightness in her throat. Life isn't about what we deserve, Adrian. She had learned that it was all about what we could handle. The hard way, the one who had made her the person she was today. She could see that his jaw was clenched, his expression of frustration and barely contained rage at the injustice of it all and your handling of it alone. She hesitated before nodding. After he asked, his voice becoming more intense and lower. Had no choice, so they kept quiet, their silence thick with years of longing and silence. The restaurant was filled with the distant clinking and soft hum of conversations. Porcelain against silverware, but nothing came to mind at the time. It was just Adrian's and the two of them sitting across from each other, with years of history and missed opportunities between them. She was brought back to the now by the slight tightening of her hand grip. He said, "You don't have to be alone anymore," and his voice was so gentle and quiet and full of conviction that it almost sounded false. She was shattered by his words and the promise they held for Adrian. Back in college, she had crushed on him from afar, convinced that had always been a dream she had never dared to reach for, that someone as charming, ambitious, and out of her league as he is would never. Though he knew Noti as someone like her, he was now gazing at her as though she were the most important thing in the world, as if he regretted their entire absence. "Adrian," she whispered, unsure of what to do, as if he wanted to make up for it. Say, unsure of how to deal with the feelings that are coursing through her. "Let me be," he said, "here for you, Elena." His deep, sincere voice sending a shudder down her spine. Spine allowed me to make up for the time we lost her breath. So why does he now allow I was a fool back then? And he let out a soft chuckle while shaking his head, as if he couldn't believe she even needed to ask. Her heart pounded so hard because I once let you slip through my fingers, and I refused to do it again. Was certain he could hear it, but it was too fast and too much. Overwhelming, but it also felt right, like something she had been anticipating without even realizing it. Realizing this may have caused her to allow herself to fall in love with him before she could answer. A moment later, the waiter brought them their food, breaking the spell. They parted their hands, but the warmth of his touch remained a phantom sensation on her skin throughout dinner, and refused to go away. Adrian kept the conversation light and made her laugh more than she had in years. It felt natural and easy, like no time had passed. He told her about his company and how he had stumbled into the corporate world as time had passed between them. She listened attentively and hung on to every word, even though she had no intention of doing so. In return, she shared a few details about her own life, but not the difficult parts. But just enough to give him hints of the girl he used to know by. As they finished their meal, a warm, inviting embrace had formed between them, though it was still fragile. When they got out of the restaurant, the night air was crisp and smelled like the city of Unbreakable. Fresh rain and possibilities illuminated the streets with the soft light of Everything was illuminated by golden lights, and the world seemed quieter and more intimate as Adrian, if it were just the two of them in their own private bubble, I'd accompany you to your taxi. Adrian. I believe I know. He spoke softly and effortlessly. She shook her head jokingly and crossed her arms. How to get to my own car, and he smiled, his eyes sparkling with mischief. Making sure you don't leave before I ask you a crucial question. She raised an eyebrow out of curiosity. Gaze, and then his expression changed, almost serious. Vulnerable. May I see you once more? Her breath caught because she hadn't anticipated that he would. So quickly asked, didn't anticipate the outpouring of emotions his words caused in her. A part of her wanted to be careful to avoid heartbreak, but the other part of her wanted to, that she knew she couldn't say, because a part of her that had never stopped wondering and never stopped yearning for no. She saw something more when she looked into his hope-filled eyes. Adrienne's radiant smile was infectious before she even said it. A man who had just received a second chance at something he believed to be lost forever. And in a way, that was precisely the purpose of this second chance. Something that had never been completed. Something that had been waiting for the right. Elena's heart raced for the first time in years as she drove off that night. Not with anxiety or fear, but rather with the thrilling thrill of the unknown, with the possibility of something really beautiful and beautiful. Elena couldn't stop thinking about how it felt like hope for the first time in a long time. Adrian was unable to shake the vivid memories of the evening's events, no matter how hard she tried. Intensity in the manner in which his deep, mesmerizing eyes had remained fixed on hers, as if she were the only woman on earth. His warm touch lingering long on her skin after he let go, as she drove through, his voice had wrapped around her heart like a whispered promise. The still streets, her hands shaking on the wheel, and her heart beating in a rhythm she hadn't felt in years. Had been so long since she had given herself permission to feel anything even remotely similar to this warmth, this ache, or this dangerous hope that threatened to breach the carefully constructed barriers she had built around herself for years. She had prepared herself to survive, be strong, and never anticipate. She had long since experienced unkindness from any aspect of her life, discovered that expectations only resulted in disappointment, but these walls had begun too. She had once seen the crack crumble under the weight of Adrian Carter's presence. In college, he watched him from a distance and silently loved him. Far too perfect for someone like her, too far out of her reach, too impossible, and yet he was back in her life, staring at her with the same fervor he had previously. Dreamed of the man who was standing in front of her now, years after he had accidentally taken her heart. It was surreal, as if he had said in front of her that he had never wanted to lose her. She was afraid of something that was real and not a dream she would wake up from at any time. Elena let out a deep sigh before anything else as she pulled up in front of her small apartment, her hands on the steering wheel tightly, as though letting go would send her into a state of emotional turmoil. She was unable to face the situation when she entered, so she leaned against the door, her unevenly rising and falling chest, her racing mind with each, "Let me be here for you tonight," in every glance, every touch, and every word he said. Elena heard his soft, firm, and determined voice echo in her head. That made her feel uneasy. Could she really allow him in? Could she allow herself to hope? Again, hope was dangerous. She had long ago forgotten about it because it had only ever caused her pain. But Adrian looked at her anyway. Tonight, as he held her hand and so sincerely whispered those words, she felt something stir. Before she could, something that she thought had died inside her before she could even begin to process her thoughts. Her phone buzzed, and she almost jumped her brie. Her breath caught as she saw his name appear on the screen. Adrienne's heart betrayed her by racing as she unlocked her phone, her fingers trembling slightly. "Adrian, were you able to get home safely?" She smiled as the anticipation built. "Elena, yes, I'm concerned." And before she could stop it, she felt a warmth rise in her chest. Adrian came right in, and I was worried that her breath hitched because he cared even after. Despite everything he had done over the years, he still cared before she could overthink. When his subsequent message arrived, she felt her heart stutter in Adrian. I meant what I said about her chest. "Elena, I don't want to lose you again, she thought. Her fingers on the keyboard were dangerous. Adrian Carter was dangerous not because he could physically hurt her, but because he could break her down, to make her feel things she'd forgotten about for a long time. But she finally decided to Ela, you never had me in the first place. So let her heart speak instead of her fears. Adrian. There was a lengthy pause and she held her breath, wondering if she had said too much. However, his response followed shortly thereafter, and it gave her the impression that it was about to burst. Adrian. You're wrong. I never had the courage to claim what was already mine. As she clutched her chest tightened and her breath caught in her throat. Phoned to her heart, he's to blame for the things he said that made her feel like Adrian Carter was a storm for making her want to believe something she had no business believing in. Though she wasn't sure if she was ready to be swept away, she knew Elena was aware that it was too late and that she was already falling the next morning, sipping her coffee, attempting to concentrate on anything but the way the conversation of the previous night had left her heart still fluttering. She didn't even have to look at the screen when her phone buzzed again to see who it was. Adrian's lips said, "What are you doing today?" He curled up involuntarily. Did he really text her first thing in the morning? Elena was obviously working. Elena almost dropped the mug when Adrian choked on her coffee. Adrian, I'm taking you out today without cabs or work. Just us and her pulse, accelerated Elena. Adrian. I have a job, Adrian, and a plane. She knew he was serious. Glared at the screen, rereading the words to make sure she wasn't thinking. Elena. Yes, I'm in a plane. Adrian abducting you for the day. Pack light. I'll pick you up in an hour, she said, completely staring at her phone. Astonished, he was completely insane, and yet, she felt a rush of excitement at the thought of going with him. But she should say no. Should resist and remind herself of all the negative aspects of this idea. But for the first time in a long time, she felt alive. Her fingers sat on the Elena is fine, but her keyboard is racing with nerves and excitement. After a split second, he responded with the same level of self-assurance and certainty as the person Adrian trusted. Elena, it will be, and in a flash, she received a single text announcing a life-altering event she had no idea about. Elena remained frozen in place in front of her small closet, her irregular heartbeat. Beats as she tried to process the whirlwind of feelings in her Adrian Carter, the man with whom she had spent her entire life. She had convinced herself for years that it was just a dream, a fleeting memory from her past. Had long buried was taking her away for the day on his L. Even the thought of it seemed out of place, like something she shouldn't have indulged in. But here she was, standing modestly. She skimmed over her clothes, trembling with apartment fingers, in an effort to decide what one even wore for an occasion like this. A sundress, jeans. She wore a business casual outfit and took a deep breath before briefly closing her eyes. Adrian had never been concerned with appearances, so why was she overthinking this? He had never appeared even in college, when he was surrounded by women who effortlessly commanded attention. Prone to being swayed by glitz, she could still recall the in quiet moments. His gaze would occasionally linger on her, as if he saw something. No one else could shake the idea away as she reached for her. It was soft, flowing, and elegant for a simple white sundress without being overbearing. She was told by something that Adrian would only be interested in her appearance. An hour later, she stood near her window and watched a sleek black vehicle pass by. Adrian stepped out of the car as it pulled up in front of her apartment, catching her breath in her throat. He wore a crisp outfit with the effortless grace of a man who was used to being in charge. White shirt with the top two buttons undone, showing a hint of tan skin. His sleeves were rolled up to his forearms, and his watch sparkled in the morning light. His dark hair was always. He looked even more devastatingly handsome than she did, perfectly styled, with a slightly unkempt appearance. Remembered, but it wasn't just how he looked that threw her heart into a frenzy. It was also the way his eyes got darker. He didn't move or speak when they touched her. Instead, he just stared as if his very breath had been taken away by the sight of her. Elena felt warmth rise in her chest as his voice was thick with something she couldn't quite identify. She asked after she suddenly stood up and felt too self-conscious. His face was covered in a slow, breathtaking smile as he looked down at her dress. Before she could even close her lips, her stomach flipped. Could gather her thoughts because he was standing in front of her, his large warm hand reaching for hers and threading. From the moment their skin met, it felt effortless to bring their fingers together. She felt something inside that she hadn't felt in years as a spark shot up her arm. Adrian held her hand as he led her to the car, as if he was afraid to let her go. Go. And she felt like a woman once more, not just for the first time in a long time. Not only a driver who takes strangers around, but also someone who is struggling to survive. The drive to the private airstrip was silent, but it wasn't someone who was seen or wanted. He would occasionally steal a glance at her, making her feel uneasy, as if he couldn't quite believe she was there. To be honest, neither could she, but when they arrived, she gasped for air. A stunning white jet, sleek and elegant, was held in her throat and sat waiting for. She turned to him, wide-eyed, its overwhelming and thrilling presence in her face. She murmured, half disbelieving, "You weren't joking about the plane?" Adrian laughed and placed him. His warm touch sent a hand on the small of her back, pushing her forward. Delicious chill down her spine. "I won't make fun of taking you away from her." Her heart skipped a beat as she sat in the jet, which was even more opulent than she had imagined. Seats made of cream-colored leather, a large cabin, and windows that only enough to give her an endless view of the sky. Everything about it screamed wealth and power. Adrian was the man she had always known to be. Successful had been mentioned in business circles as the whispers, but this was something entirely different. As the jet took off, she turned to him, her eyes narrowing, wondering exactly where we were going. He smiled with that arrogant grin that had always made her heart race. Special, she crossed her arms and raised her eyebrows. Adrian laughed and shook his head. As time went on, you'll see that the air between them became increasingly densely charged with something. Unspoken and alone in the cabin, surrounded only by the tranquil hum of the engines in the interminable sky, there was nowhere to hide or escape that she could feel his gaze on her, as she felt her emotions rise to the surface. Intense and unwavering, it made her skin tingle and her heart beat quickly. "Elena," he murmured in a soft voice as she turned her breath in response to the look in his eyes. "Command." She swallowed, her grip on her lap tightening, and yes, his gaze was there, burned into hers. "I ought to have told you in college," she told me, and her voice said, "What she asked." He said, barely above a whisper, "I wanted you," reaching for her hand as he observed you. "I wanted to be the cause of every time you laughed, even when you weren't looking." She held her breath, and her entire body stood still. For years, she had believed she was unnoticeable to him, because he had never seen her in the same light as she had. But here he was, admitting that he had. She whispered, "Had always wanted her, and had a crush on me." He chuckled, barely able to believe it, as he ran his thumb over her knuckles. "An understatement would be to say that I was obsessed with you, Elena, and when you vanished, and I thought I'd never get another chance." Her heart pounded so hard that she wanted to say something to express how much those words meant to her, but she was too overwhelmed by her feelings to do so. Too much. The situation was too intense, and she gave up before she could. She whispered, "Kiss me," before logic could point out every reason why this was dangerous. Adrian's eyes became darker, and his entire body tightened. Elena, however, had already leaned in to catch her breath, mixing with his, and he shut the door. His deep, longingful kiss on her lips took her breath away in a split second from the distance. Lungs were not soft or hesitant. Rather, it was a claim in an 8-point kiss. His hands cradled her face, and years of unspoken words, missed opportunities, and buried emotions burst free. His warm touch of his thumb on her cheek as he intensified the kiss, engulfing her completely. And at that exact instant, as the plane rose above the clouds, so did her heart. Before Adrian's lips moved against hers with slow, deliberate passion, as if he felt anything like this. Memorizing each and every one of these moments, his hands framed her face, his warmth seeping into her skin, and he left her. His touch was gentle and possessive, as if he were leaving her breathless and yearned for more. Was afraid that if he let go, she might vanish. The heat between them shattered every logical thought, leaving only this desperate, unspoken yearning that had lain dormant for years. Elena pulled him closer as she held onto his shirt. Giving in to the ferocity of the moment his body pressed against hers was strong, steady, and real. Had she spent the previous 8 years convincing herself that she had moved on from him, she would be trapped in his right now. Arms buried in his kiss, she realized the truth she had never known. She had only buried feelings were so strong that she locked them away like a secret she would never tell anyone. Herself that it was foolish of her to yearn for someone like Adrian Carter. But now that he was here kissing her like she was, none of that mattered. Was there something priceless and irreplaceable about him when every touch made her feel happy? Bringing back parts of her heart that she had thought had been frozen since Frozen was tearing down every wall she had built. And when they finally tore apart there, she was powerless to stop him. Their foreheads touching as their breaths mixed in the intimate space between them. His dark, intense gaze remained fixed on her cheeks as if in fear that she would vanish. Searched hers as if seeking confirmation that she also felt it, indicating that this was not a brief occurrence, but something much more substantial I've wanted to do for a long time. Elena's lips tingled from his long, husky, emotion-laden whisper. Kiss her as her heart continued to pound in her chest. She struggled to come up with words to make sense of the overwhelming feelings she's experiencing, if you really mean that his deep. She looked at her with brown eyes that were full of raw honesty for every word. Elena choked hard, unable to look at him because of the force of his gaze. A way I believed I was indistinguishable from you in college. Adrian took a deep breath before gently brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. She was radiant with warmth. You were never out of sight, but I saw you, Elena. I had to fight the urge to draw you in every time I did, every day and every time I did it. He had felt it as well when she clenched her heart in my arms with those sneaky glances. She caught him looking at her solely for him at those moments when their eyes met across the library. I was an idiot back then to quickly turn away from everything. I should have noticed Adrienne's thumb tracing small circles on her skin as he continued. Told you how I felt, but I was afraid that if I let you in, I wouldn't be able to. Able to let go of you, Elena felt like she was drowning in him, and her breath hitched. His words and the manner in which he looked at her made it seem as though she were the only thing that mattered. Had clung to for a long time was breaking apart under the weight of his confession. She had believed for so long that she was just a passing thought, when all along he had been fighting. She whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the ongoing battle. His lips curled into a soft, devastating sigh as her own heart beat. Smile now that I know I was right. A chill ran down my spine, down her spine, because she understood precisely what he meant by, if they did this, it would be impossible to recover if they allowed themselves to fall completely. And strangely, she wanted to say something for the first time in years without hesitation. In the torrent of emotions that swept over her, anything other than the words vanished. Instead, she gave herself permission to try something new and believed in the possibility of happiness. Between them, there was a long, pleasant silence. And then, as if sensing that, Adrian leaned back slightly, giving her the space she needed to gather herself. Space? Where are we going? She finally inquired, shifting the subject before her. Adrian laughed as he slowly let go of his hands, his heart giving away too much. Despite the fact that the warmth of his touch remained on her skin, as you'll see shortly enough to imply that the pilot's voice came through the intercom and that we were about to land on cue. Elena glanced out the window shortly after, her stomach twitching with curiosity. The vast blue ocean below them stretched out indefinitely, its waves shimmering. She turned back to Adrian Arch beneath the sun, and he smirked as he rubbed his beach brow. Not just any beach, the plane began its descent as it approached the island. White sand crystal caught Elena's breath. Clear waters, lush greenery, she turned to paradise. Adrian, where are we? He has wide eyes and his smile has softened somewhere that means a much to me. It had to be a private island, and if she wasn't already overwhelmed, another wave of feelings washed over them at the thought that he had taken her somewhere so intimate. Adrian retook her hand as soon as the plane touched down. directing her. When they got to the exit, the warm ocean breeze covered them. She turned to him, her chest, and stepped outside, the sea's salty scent filling her lungs. Tightening, he exhaled as he ran his thumb gently over the back of her hand, because I wanted to capture our first real memory together. Unforgettable. The way he said it made her pulse stutter our first time together. Real memory, as though he was already planning more, as though he wanted. This desired her for more than just the present, and may God bless her, she wanting that as well. They walked along the shore, listening to the gentle crashing of the waves. Background. The sun is slowly going down. Everything is above the horizon. The only thing she knew with absolute certainty was that this moment felt dreamlike and surreal. The fact that Adrian was real, with his warmth and presence, and his refusal to, they came to a stop in the vicinity of the water. The Adrian turned to face her, cupped her cheek, and told me what the gentle waves that were lapping at her feet. "You're right," he murmured, and she took a deep breath as her heart was about to beat. "I'm thinking, I don't want this to end, and I'm bursting." His expression slowly changed as his jaw clenched, as if her words had affected him more than she had realized. Softened, and he gently kissed her forehead. It did not have to. The gentleness of his touch made her close her eyes, maybe, just maybe. As the sun set, she had no choice but to choose. Or maybe she wanted this guy, painting the sky brilliant orange and pink below the horizon. One thing was for sure, Elena was falling for Adrian Carter this time. The moment Elena stepped off the airplane, the warm, salty breeze caressed her skin. She couldn't stop herself. As she blinked in, golden sunlight kissed her cheeks, carrying the enticing scent of the ocean. Awe, unable to comprehend the breathtaking paradise in front of her, that the island was nothing short of a dream. The water was turquoise and crystal clear, pristine white sand lying in the late afternoon sun, endlessly shimmering the unspoiled and perfect shore, while lush palm trees gently swayed in the sky was painted by the breeze, their leaves rustling softly like nature's own melody. In delicate orange and pink tones that blend seamlessly with the horizon, was paradise in its purest form, undisturbed, isolated, and awe-inspiring. Beautiful as she turned to Adrian, her heart pounding against her ribs as she tried to process everything, she turned to Adrian. She asked in a barely audible whisper, "Where are we?" He smiled and looked at her, glimmering with something naughty but sweet. "Welcome to my private island." Elena's shocked lips parted and her throat caught her breath. Island gave her a nod and moved closer to her, the comforting embrace of his presence wrapping around her. "Bought it a few years ago," and he explained in a low, smooth voice that it was my escape. When the city becomes too big, as it is now. The word ours sent chills down her spine and into every part of her. Heartbreakingly, she had no idea she'd end up on an island like this, straight out of a fairy tale with the man she had secretly fallen in love with. She was afraid to wake up from the intimacy because, for years, it felt like a dream. She felt a warmth that had not been there before from the moment of this entire experience. Nothing to do with the tropical sun, Adrian gently took her hand before she could formulate a coherent response. Threading through her hair in a manner that felt both organic and energizing, the simplest act accelerated her pulse, causing her skin to tingle where he brought her closer to him as he walked her down the wooden dock, touching her. The opulent villa with a beachfront location in the midst of the palms. The villa was an architectural masterpiece with floor-to-ceiling windows reflecting the colors of the sunset and a wide-open terrace. Thatched roof, which added to its exotic appeal, made it a popular spot for people only read about a remote haven where the outside world stopped to exist. But despite all of this beauty, Elena noticed that her attention kept wandering. When he abruptly halted, she returned to Adrian, still lost in thought. He said softly, "Walking, take off your shoes." She looked confused and blinked, up at him with a smirk, his eyes sparkling with playfulness. "Believe me." She paused for a moment before sighing, and as soon as her bare feet touched the warm sand, she slipped out of her sandals. She let out a gasp. It was softer than she had anticipated, almost silk-like, as it was Adrian molded himself into her, like his expensive leather shoes do now. Abandoned on the dock, he grabbed her hand once more and entwined them before she could say anything. Their simple touch gave her another jolt of awareness as he pulled her toward the shoreline. Her body, aware of every time his skin touched hers, the waves gently lapped at their feet were cool and refreshing against the evening's heat, and the golden sunlight warmed everything. It appeared as though the entire world had slowed down as the glow cast long shadows on the sand. Down just for them, Adrian turned to her, and his expression was more subdued than she had anticipated. Never seen before, his dark brown eyes, which are typically guarded and invulnerable, filled with something so raw and beautiful that it made her breath catch. "Throat Elena?" he murmured in a velvet-like voice. "This place is special to me. Against the whispering waves, but because you're here today, it's even more special." "Here!" Her heart clenched in agony at his words, and she felt her emotions rise like Adrian. She whispered, unsure of what to do. The tides say that she wasn't sure if she could even find the right words to say. What feeling like he was reaching out, he brushed a hair from her face, his fingers resting on her cheek in a touch. His warmth penetrated her skin with tenderness that made her tremble, sparking something deep within her. "Do you know how long I've wanted to meet you?" She swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry, and he asked in a barely audible whisper. She wanted to know what he was looking at. His thumb became darker, and he traced slow, mesmerizing circles against her jaw, too. He murmured, "Have you all to myself? No distractions, no missed opportunities, just us." The weight of his words crashing over her like a wave caught her breath. She could feel the heat radiating from his body as Adrian moved closer, closing the gap between them. "Consume me, Elena," he confessed in a husky voice filled with something deep. Unspoken, she always gets a lump in her throat. She had long held the belief that she was nothing more than a shell, her chest tightening with an overwhelming mix of emotions. Then a fleeting thought to him of a person in the crowd who was now standing here. She realized that she had always been his, with only the sky and sea as her only surroundings. And she had always had him, Adrian slowly gave him. Her chance to walk away if she wanted to, but she didn't. When he finally kissed her, it was nothing like their kiss on the... This one was slower and had a deeper kiss. It was a kiss, full of all the feelings they had held back for years, that spoke of regret, longing, and love that hadn't been set for too long. Free Elena melted into him, wrapping her arms around his neck. Completely surrendered, the world around them vanished, faded into the background as she immersed herself in him. As if he needed to feel every inch of her against him, his hands moved to her waist and pulled her closer. The waves and salt on his lips feel his breast's warmth against her skin, whispered all around them, their quiet sighs being carried by the wind and wrapping them in time seemed to stretch and bend in this intimate cocoon, making each second feel endless. And Elena was no longer just surviving. For the first time in years, she was living, and she was doing so in the arms of the man who had stolen her heart. All along the sky had become a lavender-colored hue, the last traces of sunlight disappearing below the horizon. The waves were outlined in an ethereal glow by gold and red streaks. Their rhythmic whispers blended with the cool evening breeze as they gently lapped against the shore. Jasmine and salt aroma, Elena stood barefoot in the sand, sinking her toes. Her heart was still racing from Adrienne's kiss's lingering effect, so she slipped slightly into its warmth, and completely consuming, filled with a longing that sent chills coursing down my spine. Every second of it had sent chills down her spine and felt like an unfulfilled promise. Despite the fact that they had never spoken about it, it now exists between them as the night wrapped around them like a warm embrace. She stood beside him under the soft glow of lanterns strung along. On the patio of the villa, soft golden lights danced across the surface, casting dancing shadows. Polished wooden deck provided illumination for the area where they stood, making it appear to, despite the vastness of the ocean in front of them, impossible to be intimate. The air between them was thick with something unspoken, something fragile. Yet Adrian gave her a glass of powerful something that had been hiding for years. Wine's fingers lightly brushed against hers as he did, and the brief touch sent another awareness jolt. He carefully examined her with his gloomy eyes as she caught her breath, reflecting the same intensity that had shaken her to the core hours ago to us. He murmured, raising his glass. Elena hesitated for a little while in the quiet space between them. The sound was so soft that it was barely audible over the far-off waves as she clenched her glass against his for a second. She repeated us, even though the words felt foreign to her. Could there really be an us? Could she let herself believe in something that felt so achingly right and impossible to believe in? Adrian set his glass as if sensing the glint of hesitation on her face, sat down on a nearby wooden table and once more reached out to grab her hand, was firmly but gently grounding her, bringing her back to the present and allowing her to talk to me. Elena exhaled softly as he lowered his voice, soothing her. The sight of his strong, warm hand encircling hers as I drifted down to their entwined fingers made me feel something. She felt her chest tighten because whatever it was happening so quickly. Adrian took a step closer to him after she admitted in a barely audible whisper. He counted his voice as the warmth enveloped Elena like a cocoon. She looked up at him with a quiet certainty that it was late. The sheer intensity of his gaze then caught her breath. But there is no doubt, no second guessing, just unwavering conviction. I should have told you years ago how I felt. He continued to brush the back of her hand with his thumb idly. I should have pursued you as soon as I realized you were gone, but I didn't, and I'm sorry I didn't. She had long believed she had, but his words caused her heart to twitch painfully. Been alone in her feelings, but he never realized he was struggling with his own regrets, his own welch, Adrian whispered, his voice thick with ifs. I don't want to waste another second. Emotion, I don't care if this is crazy or sudden. All I care about is that I want you, and I've always wanted you. No one had ever looked at her with her throat caught in their throat like Adrian was now, as if she were something, precious and unchangeable, like the fact that she was his entire world. I have no idea how to do this, she admitted in a barely audible voice. Adrian cued her face into his hands and said, I don't know how to let myself have something this good. Then let me show you how. His touch is impossible to resist while being incredibly gentle. Silently pleaded with her to trust him and believe in what they could be before whispering his gaze over her shoulder. Before she could even consider protesting, he reached out and pressed slowly, a long-lasting kiss to her knuckles, the simple act of kissing her. Elena. He murmured against her, sending a delicious shiver down her spine and a wild stuttering of her pulse. Skin. His voice was so tender that it made her knees tremble. Just say yes. She bit her lip, her mind battling the crashing emotions. Everything she had experienced in her life had taught her to be careful, to guard her heart, and to never. Adrian had always been the Adrian, had allowed anyone too much access. Exceptionally, despite her best efforts, he remained the only person she could never forget. And perhaps it was time to give up fighting it, or perhaps it was time to. She allowed herself to fall and whispered, taking a slow, shaky breath. Okay. Adrian gave a slow, breathtaking smile, one that made her. She felt her stomach flutter in a way she had never experienced before, and Victory smiled with relief. Happiness of something infinitely deeper and more profound than the fact that it had been settled, he said. She tilted her head slightly, her lips curving into, as he pulled her close to him, with arms around her waist. He grinned as she gave him a small smile of her own, his grip tightening as if he never wanted to let her go. And I won't let you go either. She laughed again, this time softly and with air, and then she laughed with something. She was in a state of pure happiness she hadn't experienced in years, and Adrian leaned into securing her lips for a second-long, slow kiss that enveloped the world around them, melted away for the night, when there were only love and no doubts or worries. The soft embrace of the warm, tropical air around them carried the faint. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of waves against the shore and the faraway scent of jasmine and salt. Elena and Adrian were outside, the breeze rustling the palm trees. The villa was gold and lit by lanterns, casting shadows that flickered across the wooden deck. The table nearby held empty wine glasses that had been left behind in the presence of something much more intoxicating, the gentle yet powerful pull that brought Adrian into her arms, encircled her with his hands, making sluggish patterns on her back and sending shivers her way. She was uneasy not only because of the warmth of his touch across her skin, but also because of the tenderness he held her as if she were something delicate and priceless that he feared he might lose again. And for how long, God? Had she desired this? That someone actually see her, and not just a fleeting presence, rather than as someone who could be overlooked or forgotten, who was important? Elena, Adrian murmured barely a whisper as his lips touched hers. Temple, she closed her eyes and took in the sensation. It was more than just a name. The way her name sounded on his lips was a prayer. She responded softly, afraid that she would speak too loudly, would break the delicate moment they were in, so he pulled back just enough to allow their eyes to meet, and the force of his gaze made her stomach turn, indicating something. Real, she blinked, taken aback by his abrupt request. Which real, she repeated. His hand rose to tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear as she spoke barely above a whisper. I want to know the parts of you that no one sees. Elena felt her heart pound. Had constructed walls her entire life to protect herself from the possibility of being hurt or disappointed. Even she had guarded parts of herself when she was with Adrian, never really believing she could expose them, but here, beneath the soft on an island, where time seemed to stop just for them, the glow of lanterns. She felt something she hadn't done in a very long time. Taking a deep, slow breath, she looked past him. She focused on the horizon, where the sky kissed with her eyes. Ocean. I always worried that I would be forgotten. His eyebrows furrowed in concern as Adrian's grip on her waist became slightly tighter, and he repeated as if the very concept was unthinkable. So she nodded with a soft, sad smile that tugged at her lips. As a child, I was always the quiet one, the girl who blended in. Even when I was in college, I felt invisible. Adrian sharply inhaled his, You were never invisible, Elena, he said, your fingers lightly crinkling against her back. She let out a soft sigh, his voice firm and laced with something raw and uncompromising. Disbelieving laugh shaking her head. That's not how it felt, him move his hand to her cheek and gently cup it, forcing her to look at him. He murmured, We're the brightest thing in every room you entered? I simply lacked the courage to tell you then. Her heart was pounding violently against her ribs, and her breath was stuck in her throat. Adrian's thumb brushed over as she whispered, almost terrified of his response. Her lower lip, his intense dark eyes were fixed on hers, sending chills down her spine. Shivering down her spine right now, I won't let a day go by. Elena felt a lump in her throat without mentioning how unforgettable you are. No one had ever witnessed her chest tighten with emotions that were too overwhelming to name. Looked at her like she were something to be cherished. No one had ever addressed her in such a way before. Steadfast certitude, and at that very moment, she realized that this wasn't just a passing obsession with Adrian. This wasn't just a new attraction. It was something else altogether. Deeper, something that had been hidden for years. Adrian slowly pursed his lips. Do you believe me when I say that his breath warmed her skin as it hovered just above hers? Elena murmured and shakily exhaled, her hand settling on his chest. She admitted, Then let me show you, and feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her fingertips. I want to, she said. After that, he kissed her, but it wasn't like the kisses they had previously shared. Was neither a hesitant exploration nor a desperate passion rush. Something new and different. This was more than just a promise. It was a slow, deep claim of everything she had ever feared and everything she was about to become. His hands on Adriana's waist pulled her closer and shaped her body to his aching tenderness as his lips brushed against hers. The warmth of his embrace. She collapsed against him and gave in, dizzy from the moment's sheer intensity. Complete tangle of her fingers in his hair as he intensified the kiss as though he couldn't get enough of her, and she couldn't either, as the world around them vanished. The lanterns above could barely be heard away from the faraway waves. The way his lips felt against hers was all that mattered as a golden glow was cast over their entwined forms. When they finally parted, he held her in his hands as if she were sacred. Adrian pressed his forehead against hers while mixing their breaths in the space between them. His hold on her was firm, as if he was concerned that she might escape and remain here with me. It wasn't just an invitation to stay on the plane that made Elena's heart race so fast tonight. Island, it was an invitation to something more, something deeper, something real. She looked into his eyes in search of hesitation or ambiguity, but there was none other than pure, undeniable love for allowing herself to believe in it for the first time in her life, she whispered. Adrienne's slow, warm smile had something that made her chest tighten. As he led her toward he grabbed her hand tightly and twisted their fingers together. Under the soft glow of the villa, their shadows stretched along the wooden deck. Lanterns. A quiet certainty settled in her chest with each step she took. She had spent years persuading herself that true, all-consuming love was not meant to be something fleeting and out of reach for her. But when Adrian pulled her in, his gaze never left her. She realized she had erred by leaving hers, and that her love had been waiting for her all along. And tonight, when she was ready to claim it, the villa's warm air carried the faint aroma of jasmine and the salty sea breeze that blew through the balcony doors. There was a steady rhythm in the distance, a soft hum from the ocean. As Elena moved deeper into the room, the golden glow of candlelight flickered to match her heartbeat. Against the walls, casting long, jiggling shadows, these shadows gave the impression that everything was from a dream. Her fingers were still entwined with Adrian's, and his touch was what grounded her, something she had never dared to believe could be real. Anchoring her in a moment that seemed so out of place, she took every step as though it were. She was crossing over into something more substantial, something that extended beyond the present and had always been waiting for them. The years of waiting, 8 years, weighed on her. Longing expressed in unspoken memories, but none of that mattered now. Standing here on the thea, she ought to have been anxious and uneasy, on the verge of something that would alter everything. But Adrian looked at her as though she were the only thing in the world that mattered, and she felt safe everywhere. Adrian looked at her, examining hers with such ferocity that she felt chills run down her spine. His grip on her hand tightened as if he needed to be sure that she wanted this just as much as he did. He murmured low as he was doing Elena, husky with a roar, "And how vulnerable are you?" He wasn't, despite the fact that she felt the weight of his question sinking in under her. Requesting everything at this very moment in exchange for the trust of she choked hard on her love for a future that had once seemed impossible. But there she spoke without hesitation, and I've never been more certain of a mixture of relief was softened by Adrian's expression in any way. And something more profound and deeper, he exhaled slowly, as though he'd been holding his breath for a long time, and then he raised her hand to his lips and pressed it slowly in reverence. A simple kiss to her knuckles caused her to tremble, awakening something deep. She had something deep within her that she had long suppressed. This wasn't just desire, was something much more perilous. "Love, Elena," he repeated, whispering her name, rolling off his tongue like a holy vow. "You have no idea, dear, how long I've been waiting for this." She softly smiled and moved closer, raising her free hand. To lie down on his back under her palm, his heartbeat was steady and strong, but she looked up at him, her eyes searching for his, and that instant passed. She could feel how quickly it accelerated under her touch. She saw it all, his longing, his regret, his love for her all these years, and she decided to stop waiting. The world seemed to stop for a split second as Adrian's breath hitched in whispers. Then he quickly wrapped his arms around her and pulled her against him. He conformed her body to his, and her warmth and presence were overwhelming. She could, in the best possible way, feel his strength as he held her, with a desperate expression that reflected years of longing and missing what had always been. At first, his lips met hers slowly, like a question, promise, or whisper of something too valuable to rush, followed by the dam broke. The kiss grew more intense and consumed them both, filling them with every emotion they had been kept away for too long, and everything had been stolen, not just passion. It was the glance, every suppressed emotion, every sore night spent apart. Every Adrian kissed her as the weight of 8 years fell on them, freeing them. His hands moved up her like he was afraid she would leave, like he was starving for her right now. Back, he held her closer by tracing the delicate curve of her spine with his fingers. Luring her into his embrace as if he wanted to merge with her, he whispered Elena into her ear. Her name, a prayer, a confession, and a plea that she lost when she tangled her fingers in his hair. There was in his taste and the way he made her feel alive, cherished, and loved. There was no hesitation in the way he touched her or kissed her, as if he were making up for lost time. Like he was claiming her in the only way he could, he lifted her up. His firm yet gentle grip on her was effortless, as if she weighed nothing. As he carried her toward the bed and the outside world, she gasped against his lips and felt her fingers digging into his shoulders. All that mattered was this: the ocean, the stars, and the island. Only them. And when he laid her down, his lips touched her in an unimaginably tender way, tracing a line of gentle, reverent kisses along her jaw and down her spine throat. She was aware that this was love and not just passion and desire. Unadulterated, undeniable love. And she was his, just as he was hers. Secrets spoken in the quiet of the night were whispered confessions that filled the air. Adrian's hands mapped every inch of her skin as if he had memorized her, and his kisses were slow, as if he worshipped her. Elena had never experienced this kind of lingering, as if he wanted to make up for every moment they had lost. Before she became like that, she was something she treasured, something she had spent years convincing others of. Adrian convinced her that he made her feel despite her belief that such love didn't exist and was beyond her reach. They got lost in each other like she was at home as the night went on. Their bodies were intertwined and their hearts beat perfectly. There were no doubts, no worries, just endless love and all-consuming. And Adrienne wrapped Elena in her as she finally fell asleep. She knew that she was meant to be with him in these arms. As the morning sun shone through the windows, Elena always shook. The crisp white sheets were streaked with golden flecks as the balcony doors opened. She was enveloped in a warm embrace by the salt and jasmine scents that lingered in the air. But what really held her in was he was the place that made her heart race before she even opened her eyes. Shurin. His body was solid and warm, his arm wrapped around her waist to protect her. His constant breathing against her back licked the nape of her neck, and she felt she had spent. She shivered at the reality of waking up in his arms. Years persuading herself that she had changed, as Adrian Carter had merely a distant memory, but last night had broken. He had kissed her in all of those illusions like she were his best friend. Treasure loved her like he had been waiting his whole life to. Treasure held her like she was something irreplaceable. The weight of what had happened and what this meant settled deeply in her chest as she lay in his arms. Could she really allow herself to have this, if it were true? Her thoughts were, you're thinking too much, was interrupted by a deep, sleepy voice. A shiver ran. As Adrian laid a lazy kiss on her shoulder, his harsh voice sent chills down her spine. She awoke from her sleep and slightly turned to face him, her breath catching at the sight of his. His strong jawline was framed by the beginnings of stubble, and his dark hair was tousled. He had a softness she had never seen before in his sleepy eyes, tenderness that broke her heart. "Good morning," he said, tucking in a strand of Elena swallowed hard in the morning, her hair behind her ear, and smiled slowly, her heart melting. She let out an uncontrollable laugh as she spread her lips and said, "You look beautiful." His fingers traced her cheek as I just awoke. "And you're still the most beautiful as anything I've ever seen." Music. She quickly warmed her cheeks and felt Adrian turned away from her, and his smile slightly dimmed as Elena carefully listened to what she had to say to me. She sighed and flicked her fingers lightly, tracing patterns on his chest. "This is how we feel." But real Adrian stood up on one elbow, his eyes getting darker with something. Unintelligible, he said, "It's real. I've wondered for years whether I'm not letting go of Elena if I ever get another chance with you." Clenched her teeth. But what if he... Elena's breath was caught as he interrupted her by cupping her face in his hands. "I love you." He loved her, and she felt her heart stop when he saw her expression of shock. Adrian took a deep, shaky breath and said, "I love you," softly this time, And I'm not saying this to scare you. Rather, I'm telling you the truth to break your heart. As she looked at Adrian, her eyes were pricked, and he kissed her forehead and her nose, then the corner of her lips. You do not need to respond at this point. Know that I love you so much that I always shed a tear for you. When Adrian grabbed it with his thumb off her cheek, she felt like her heart was about to burst because, deep down, she had always loved him as well. And it's possible that she was finally ready to admit it, she said, taking a deep breath. I think I'm falling in love with you. Adrian's eyes became darkened with something dark and raw, and he said nothing more. Kissed her with a kiss that felt like it would last forever. A kiss that felt like coming home. And as he held her close, Elena knew she was in the right place. But she was happy, but there was still a pain in her chest and a persistent fear that whispered doubts behind her back. Of her mind, what if this was only temporary? What if everything vanished at once? Adrian pulled as they left this island, as if he could sense her hesitation. Back just enough to look into her eyes and figure out what was wrong. She hesitated, not knowing how to voice the storm of her emotions. I'm scared, she finally admitted. Of what he said calmly, reassuringly, and terrifiedly. This won't last, that when everything will change if we return to our actual lives. Adrian's gaze softened, and Elena saw their fingers entwine as he reached for her hand. I didn't find you again just to lose you, and nothing will change how I feel about you. Her chest tightened. But what? If it wasn't that easy, Adrian slowly exhaled while moving his thumb. Scrubbing her knuckles, I am aware that life is difficult. I am aware that we cannot remain in this small bubble, and that we both have responsibilities, forever. But that does not mean that what we have here is not real or has to be. And despite her sincere desire to believe him, Elena's past had taught her otherwise. That love did not always prevail, that despite two people's best intentions, life had other plans for them. And plans? Do you have faith in me? Adrian asked in a soft but firm voice, his deep, unwavering eyes which have held her in their grasp ever since when she saw him for the first time again. And that's when she realized something. She did trust him more than she whispered that she had ever trusted anyone. Adrian smiled and kissed her, to the inside of her wrist, and then trust that we'll come up with a solution together. She let out a soft breath. As she nodded, she might not have all the answers right now, or maybe there were still questions beyond this island, but she had Adrian for the time being. She was in this moment, and maybe that was enough for Adrian to once more pull her close, kissing her on the lips. Was both scrumptious and lingering, as we always have in the world, Elena. She shut her eyes and allowed herself to sink into his warm security of his embrace, and as the sun rose higher in the sky, it cast its Elena made a secret promise to herself that she would not golden glow over the entire world. She refused to let doubt overshadow the blossoming love between them, letting fear steal this from her. She had something to fight for the first time in a long time, and she was determined not to let it slip through her fingers. Elena had never experienced the sensation of being weightless when letting go of every doubt, every apprehension, and simply fell until now. The morning sun gave Adrian's private island golden hues, and the waves lapped gently against the shore. As she stood on the balcony of the villa, her surroundings seemed more peaceful and softer. His hands were on Adrian's waist, and his chin was pressed against the curve. He held her from her shoulder as though she were something fragile. Yet say it again. Irreplaceable, Adrian murmured, brushing his lips against the eardrum here. Elena felt her. Heat in her cheeks, she turned to meet his gaze, saying what he smirked. You know. She wasn't what her heart pounded, a nervous thrill coursing through her veins. Adrian wasn't like anyone else, but she was used to this and letting herself be loved so openly. Besides, he was the only person who had ever looked at her like she was everything. Put my hand on his chest and felt the steady beat of his heart. I think I'm falling in love with him. With Adrian, his smile gave way to something more serious. He cued Elena's face gently with his thumb, tracing her cheek as if to memorize her entire face. I want you to know that you don't have to. If you fall, don't worry. I'll always be here to catch you, she said as a lump formed in her throat. She thought she wasn't good enough for him for so many years, but he had always loved her. And now, as she looked into his eyes, she finally allowed herself to believe it. So she did what she had always been unwilling to try. But she fell in love with you. Adrienne. Although she whispered the words, they carried the weight of 8 years of longing. Adrienne let out a shaky breath after years of pondering what might have been 8 years of unspoken love. Breathe in deeply as his arms close around her. Repeat it, and she laughed softly. I love, he kissed her by crushing his lips against hers before she could finish her sentence. Her with everything he had, a tasteless kiss that took her breath. Of promises and for the rest of her life, Elena melted into him, her fingers becoming entangled in his hair. As she lost, Adrienne pressed her head on his while they were finally breaking up. You have no idea how long I've waited to hear those against hers. Words she smiled, stroking his jaw with her fingers. And then I guess it's good that I'm intending to repeat them for the rest of my life. Adrienne let out a soft, shaking laugh. Elena smiled. I'd prefer to be, as he bowed his head in wonder. You're going to be the death of me, woman. The reason you exist, his gaze became clouded by something incontestable about who you already are. Followed by, he gave her a second passionate kiss as the sun rose behind them, and the warmth of the morning wrapped around the promise of a future that neither of them would ever let go of. Them, but nothing compared to Adrienne's embrace's warmth. He held her as if he couldn't believe she was real, as if she were the most precious thing he had ever touched. Telling him the words he had once feared he would never say standing there in his arms. She repeated, Here, I love you, her fingers tracing his line. Adrienne's eyes became so dark with emotion that she felt her chest rise. Again he breathed, his lips barely brushing against hers, joking. Testing, Elena smiled softly, placing her hands on his heart and saying, I love you. Before he once more seized her lips and pulled her against him with Adrienne let out a low groan. Desperate feeling that sent heat coursing through her body. She could feel his heart beating beneath her touch. Feel his slight trembling, as if he were repressing everything he wanted to give her, and God knew she wanted it too. She wanted him all, not just on this island, but throughout her entire life. Adrienne reached out to stroke her cheek, as they finally parted, breathless and flushed. Elena tilted her head with a playful glint in her eyes. You've ruined me, right? So Adrienne smirked, but his expression showed a hint of tenderness underneath. Because I can't let go of you now that I have you in my heart. Emotions that were squeezed came crashing down on her like waves against the shore. But Adrienne's grip on her was strong as words and unspoken promises hung between them, tightened as he looked at her, his eyes checking to see if she really meant it, before slowly bending his lips. Into a jaw-dropping smile. You'll never know how happy you are. Just made me feel it. I felt the rapid heartbeat as Elena's fingers trailed down his chest. Think I do. Adrienne wrapped his arms around her once more, after taking a shaky breath in. She pulled her into his embrace and buried her face in his neck, inhaling the heady aroma of his touch. Steady beat of his breath against her skin. This was where he was at home. She was meant to be, and she was certain that she had done the right thing. Adrienne just pulled back. Choice what happens now, she murmured against his skin. Enough to stare at her, his eyes filled with unwavering resolve, now that we live together with her. She echoed the simple but powerful word with her collective breath. Adrienne took her despite the weight of everything. No more doubts, no more worries, just them, before tying their fingers together, hand kissing her palm. Are you ready for that? Elena met his gaze. She was pounding her chest, but this time it wasn't out of fear, but rather out of certainty. From love, because she knew she was exactly who she was. For the first time in her life, I've never been more prepared. And Adrienne pulled her into the place where she belonged. Another stunning kiss as the morning sun illuminates them with its golden rays. Because she was falling this time, Elena was certain of one thing. She was no longer afraid. The golden sun dipping, the waves gently smashed against the shore without fear. Into the horizon, causing pink and orange streaks to appear across the entire sky. The island's glow suggested that nature itself was celebrating the love that had finally returned to the air. Smelt like jasmine and salt, the same scent that had covered them the previous night. Elena stood barefoot in the soft sand the night everything had changed. In contrast to the cool ocean breeze that had teased the warm grains beneath her feet behind her, strands of her hair, the villa stood like a mute witness to the love in front of. They had rekindled the love they had refused to lose again. Adrian was her, and he was just a few steps away from her, his dark eyes fixed on hers. Expression that was full of raw emotion, and the way he looked at her made her knees weak as if she was the most precious thing he had ever seen. As if he still wasn't sure she was real. "His Elena," he murmured as he drew nearer, his hands reaching her waist and touching her fingers. "You have no idea how much I love you," when you touched the fabric of her dress. Her heart swelled her breath in response to his tender voice. But she knew she felt the same way with every heartbeat and breath she took, so she knew exactly how much he loved her. Everything in her head pointed back to him, which she covered with her hands. His lacing, their fingers clinging to him as though she was worried that this was just a dream. "I do, Adrian," she whispered. "I love you just as much as his," her voice heavy with emotion. Elena's breath hitched as her lips curled into a breathtaking smile that warmed her up instantly. The waves, the rustling of the wind, and the rest of the world around her suddenly stopped. She could only hear the palm trees as they all vanished into silence. The only thing she could see was the wild beating of her heart. His eyes never left Adrian as he stepped back, reaching into his pocket. Hers, and then he pulled out a beautiful, delicate sapphire ring, tucked away in the middle, with the deep blue reflecting the endless ocean behind them. The ocean that brought them back together, the place where, after so many years, they found each other again. She exhaled, her hands flying to her mouth, and her chest tightened as she exhaled. Adrian was overcome with emotion. His name was barely spoken. Barely a breath, he said, "I don't want to waste another second." With assurance and the kind of love that had stood the test of time and distance and heartache. "We have already lost 8 years, and I do not wish to lose another day. Another hour, another moment, when I am absolutely certain that Elena's eyes welled up with tears because it was always you." As the weight of his words sank into her soul, her vision began to blur. All her life, she had been afraid of being forgotten, of never truly being seen. Adrian had always seen her, even when she thought she wasn't there. Not in his heart or mind, but as he stood now, had never let her go. There had never been another choice before her, offering her everything she knew. She let out a trembling breath as she realized that he was her only option. Yes, Adrian calmed his tense body with a smile that broke through her tears. If he hadn't heard her correctly, he said it again, in a voice that was almost desperate. As she nodded, she let out a small, helpless chuckle of joy, like 1,000 shooting stars. "Adrian Carter, yes," she said, her voice stronger and now full of nothing. "However, in love and assurance, I'll marry you." A deep exhale. Before he sprinted forward, he wrapped his arms around her and spun her, lifting her off her feet. In the air, and then he kissed her, a kiss of promises and forever. That indicated that she was his now and forever, and everything around them vanished. When he finally set her down, the golden light of the sunset illuminated their entwined bodies as they clung to one another. As he reached for hers, his hands slightly trembled. "I can't believe this is real," he said. Elena smiled and stroked her, murmuring, "His eyes are searching for hers, as if to make sure she wouldn't disappear." Adrian let out a shaky breath as the fingers on his jaw proved to be real. His movements were careful and reverent before he put the ring on her finger. And once it was in place, despite the crashing waves and the emergence of stars in the night sky, one thing was certain, that this was not the end of their relationship. It was only the later that night, as they lay under the stars, the gentle rustle of the Elena rested her head against the palm trees, which blended with the gentle lull of the waves. Adrian's chest as she listened to his steady heartbeat. "I never imagined I'd have this," she murmured, and Adrian's hands slowly made circles along her back, tracing her, took a deep breath in anticipation of the scent of his embrace with her. Tilted her head upward. His dark eyes were filled with something infinitely large. Deserve every last bit of it, Elena, and I'll spend the rest of my life proving it to you, she said, her throat tightening. Adrian kissed his shirt with her fingers, which you already had. She stayed there for a while. Before whispering, allow me to spend the rest of my life ensuring that you never doubt it. Once more, Elena shut her eyes, letting his warmth and depth embrace her. She felt love in her bones, and she was no longer afraid for the first time in her life. Because she was aware that forever had already begun, she was not afraid of losing him nor of the future.